As you look at a sentence and wonder about the idea of what non-restrictive or non-essential information, just think you know what it means to be essential, you know what it means to be non-essential. So in a sentence, if the reader doesn't need to know the information for the sentence to make sense, well, in that case, we don't need to have that information. So it's non-essential information, in which case we can hide it between commas. And that's what the comma does in a non-restrictive or non-essential information way. It separates. So the punctuation guide, which I'll return to time and time again here for examples, illustrates this point pretty well with these first two examples of giving something to someone named Tom. In the first example, I will give the document to my brother, Tom. We find out that the writer only has one brother. Well, that makes sense because the information lets us know that that comma tells us there's only one brother, and that's why it's parenthetically set off with that comma. Compared to the second example, I will give the document to my brother Tom. In this example, we need to know that Tom is the specific brother because there are likely other brothers here, and that's what the lack of the comma, the absence of the comma, tells us. So just by having that one mark of punctuation, the sentence changes its meaning. So to be able to control a sentence in that way with one simple swipe of the pen or press of a key, you have the opportunity to explain information to a reader to avoid confusion, which is your onus in writing a sentence, to explain information, to communicate meaning, so that comma becomes an important piece of information. You can see the same idea illustrated in the Hawthorne example as well. You can see the same idea illustrated in the Hawthorne examples as well. When it comes to non-essential explanations, which again are just asides or a positive information, and that's just a fancy way of saying information that's non-essential, you offset with commas, just as above. So Mary, a staff writer at the Big City Times, recently wrote a book. It's information that describes the person right before or after that comma. And when we do this, we just offset it, double offset it with commas before and after. You could easily excise that information, just delete all of it, and the sentence makes perfect sense. Mary Smith recently wrote a book on that subject. What's different? Well, that additional information, that explanatory note that tells us something about Mary Smith, a writer, Mary Smith, a thinker, Mary Smith, someone that I used to know, recently wrote a book on that subject. And that's what that parenthetical or that double offset comma does. It tells the reader some fact about the subject that it modifies, but in a non-essential way. The same thing works in the second example. The building's window placement is among its most distinctive features. That sentence is grammatically correct, but if we wanted to add that element of referred to by architects as fenestration, we need to use a comma to introduce it and to close it off, to bring it back. So oftentimes when you do add a comma, you oftentimes will add a second comma because you're introducing something and then closing it back off. And so when you think about it that way, if you're opening the sentence to input something, you need to close it as well. So oftentimes it's with a comma. However, if you're ending a sentence, you could very easily end it with a period instead of a comma, obviously, so it'd be comma and a period. So when you look at that, you're thinking to yourself, I'm adding extra information. Well, think back to the video about the parts of speech and how a sentence works. What information is essential and what's not? So, for example, we could just start with this part of the sentence. A staff writer at the Big City Times recently wrote a book on that subject and get rid of that comma. Those two things are equal. Mary Smith equals a staff writer at the Big City Times. So we couldn't just have no commas here. Mary Smith, a staff writer, because then you have two sentence subjects. So as soon as you know that both of those are noun phrases or sentence subjects, you know that they have to be separated by commas. And throughout this list, you see the same pattern. Essentially, anything that is non-essential to the sentence grammatical or mechanical ability to be a complete sentence is non-essential. It's circular, but it's obvious as well. So with that and which, this is an American usage usually, but John's cars that are leased are never kept clean. That expression lets us know specifically which one it restricts meaning, whereas which John's cars, which are leased, are never kept clean. That's a non-essential information, whereas the that tells us specifically which cars. The which here in the second example tells us something about the cars. It doesn't specify, it doesn't restrict. So in this example, you kind of get the comparison between something that tells us which one it is. Think back to the example of Tom versus Tom, right? So one tells us which Tom, the other one doesn't tell us anything about Tom. So that helps us to kind of compare that and which. And so forth here. Interrupting elements, introductory matter, afterthoughts, these are all examples of information that interrupt a sentence and require that idea of opening and closing. So your work has been awful. Well, we can kind of modify that, right? Your work has been, frankly, awful. And that word, frankly, is interruptive. It's not essential to the sentence's meaning. So we open the sentence. Imagine just kind of putting a caret there, a little insert mark, and inserting it, and then having to close it back up so it fits. So you're stitching the sentence together, and that's what that comma does. It tells the reader visually this is not an important information to the sentence grammar, but it does help us to have more information, and oftentimes tone or color. Same thing with introductory matter or afterthoughts. I found the painting to be rather dull, to be honest. I found the painting rather dull. You will be joining us for dinner, won't you? Leave some food for me, please. These are all exceptionally non-essential information. We could just strike them, right? You'll be joining us for dinner? Leave some food for me. We will not be attending the reception. The other information is just ancillary, secondary, and that because of that, it needs to be offset with commas.